Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you, Mr. Hendrickson. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The Jamaica's National Solid Waste Management Authority, has come in the spotlight on a number of occasions, and really for the best of reasons. Whether it be unsecured dump sites, or uncollected garbage, or landfill fires virtually on an annual basis. Jamaican taxpayers have painfully remembered how the 2012 landfill fire at the Riverton disposal site cost them $25 million to extinguish. Only to see 3 years later, another fire at the same facility cost them 8 times more. But these are just, the financial costs. What about the cost to businesses, cost to the environment, cost to public health? In that very example of 2015, the Riverton fire was directly responsible for 1,000 persons visiting healthcare facilities. 63 schools had to be closed, and this affected more than 61,000 students. And these are just public schools, ladies and gentlemen. So we understand why persons are concerned about solid waste management in this country. And that's why we're here today. And this is particularly interesting when one considers the mandate of the NSWMA. And according to the NSWMA Act of 2001, the NSWMA is charged with safeguarding public health through responsibly taking care of our solid waste in an environmentally sound way. And this is why persons have been asking so many questions about solid waste in this country, and why we are here. Could privatization help us to address some of these issues? And the question is why? Why is the NSWMA having such difficulty? Do we believe that workers at the NSWMA are simply sitting around all day watching Leicester City win the Premier League this year, or talking about how what was it? I think it was Golden State Warriors lost the NBA. We don't think that's the case. And here's why. First, the National Solid Waste Management Authority is significantly under-resourced. 2 years ago, for example, then executive director of the agency, Jennifer Edwards, said that of the 274, I believe, trucks that were needed to optimally service the country, the NSWMA only had 55. Most of which were inoperable. And withstanding the additional 50 that they contracted, the NSWMA had less than 20% of its ideal fleet capacity. Less than 20%. Additionally, because Jamaica fails to properly plan for its urban and rural development, we have the emergence of a number of informal communities, usually characterized by poor road conditions, making it difficult for trucks to go up there. And this is by no means absolving anyone from any human culpability. Indeed, as you'll find in our report, the number of charges levied against the agency by other state organizations, such as NEPA and the Office of the Contractor General, seem to suggest that there is some human error at play. Perhaps the NSWMA is short-staffed. Perhaps some persons weren't adequately taking care of their responsibilities, and possibly a combination of both. So where do we go from here? Could privatization help to address some of these inefficiencies? That's certainly what a lot of people have argued. Others, on the other hand, have stated that it won't solve the problem. There's something else. And these are some of the questions that we want to answer here. Should we privatize? If we should privatize, what model should we use? What are some of the things we ought to be taking account of if we go along this process? And what lessons could we possibly learn from other countries? That's what we're trying to answer today. But before we do that, I want to show you what the ideal solid waste management framework looks like. People in the field call it an integrated sustainable solid waste management system. And critical to ISSWM is what we call the hierarchy principle. And the hierarchy principle essentially says that we ought to prioritize waste prevention and minimization, recycle, reuse, and extract what we can from the waste that we actually do generate, and as a last resort, dispose of solid waste. Jamaica does the exact opposite. Additionally, we need to consider that different waste generators produce different forms of waste. For example, a factory may produce a lot of chemical waste, and you and your families may, throw out a lot of banana peels and yam peels. These need to be treated differently. So collect them separately, treat them separately. So this is ideally where we want to get to. The question is, could privatization take us there? I want to quickly run through this section. There are 4 basic privatization models. The first is what they call the contracting out model. And essentially, the government remains responsible and delegates some tasks to the private sector. The second model is a franchise model, where private entities given monopoly privileges in a particular area collect directly from the producers of waste. The third model is a concession agreement, usually longer-term contracts where the government needs to guarantee, for example, a minimum amount of waste. That's concessions. And the fourth is open competition. It's free-for-all. Everybody just contracts whoever they want to manage their waste. You'll find in the report a more in-depth analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these models. But the big takeaway here is that whichever model that we consider inevitably has to be tailored to suit our conditions here in Jamaica. So, does privatization work in practice? To answer this question, we assessed 3 case studies, but I'll only talk about 2 right now in the presentation. First, let's take a look at Bahamas. So let's start close to home. Unlike Jamaica, there's a huge privatization debate following yet another major fire at the New Providence facility in the Bahamas. So in 2014, the government privatized. Companies such as Bahamas Waste was responsible for collecting garbage, and another company called Renew Bahamas received a 5-year contract to build a recycling plant, do some upgrade work to the landfill, and do what they call waste stream characterization, essentially categorizing the different waste that's collected and separating them. The question is, did this work for the Bahamas, and what lessons could we learn? Well, Bahamas did receive some benefits. One, they saw, for example, the mobilization of private resources to construct a new recycling plant. They installed new way bridges. They upgraded some of the road network. And interestingly, one of the private companies called Bahamas Waste creatively collected waste cooking oil from restaurants such as KFC and Wendy's, processed this oil to create biodiesel, and combined it with imported petrol to fuel their fleet. Of course, this in turn minimized their dependence on imported fuel. But everything didn't go according to plan. Here's why. First, there was an informational deficiency. Private companies came in this particular case, Renew Bahamas, and they actually underestimated the costs that they would have incurred. And that's why Renew Bahamas is currently trying to renegotiate its contract with the government. According to Renew Bahamas, there were several unknown variables that they could not have accounted for prior to starting operations. And having now seen the operations, they want to change their contract. Another flaw with the Bahamian experience is this. There was a significant breakdown in government accountability and transparency. So for example, the Ministry of Environment and Housing has now hired an accounting firm, I think it's called Kiki Virakis and Company, to evaluate Renew Bahamas' business model. But there are 2 problems with this, ladies and gentlemen. First, this evaluation is taking place 2 years after the contract was first awarded. And secondly, Renew Bahamas' entire business model is predicated on generating revenue from recycling, an industry in and of itself that requires huge volumes of recycled materials to be successful. What's worse is that Renew Bahamas is separating and getting their materials from the landfill, when every piece of literature and every case study explicitly states that if you separate your waste at the landfill and not at the source, your operational costs increase dramatically. That was the Bahamian experience. And finally, the government had a weak capacity to monitor the performance of these companies. So for example, Renew Bahamas to this date has yet to submit audited financial statements to the government for the year 2015. Now let's quickly look at Egypt, a more successful case. Egypt reaped the benefits that Bahamas also reaped, and a particular observation was that Egypt was able to expand solid waste management services to areas previously unserviced. And they did this by contracting companies who were able to bring in machinery that suited the particular needs of each community. This was also particularly successful because the Egyptian case, the government actually effectively monitored performance. The governorate, for example, hired 130 persons to carry out monitoring activities. The governor himself got personally involved. In the contracts that they offered to private companies, there were clear performance measures for them to engage the public. And that's another critical feature here with the Egyptian case. The government carried out an effective public education campaign tied into the contracts with private companies, actually, to effectively get the Egyptian persons on board. This occurred in two cities, Kenya and Alexandria. So what do these cases teach us? We actually found glaring similarities between these cases and what literature has told us about solid waste management. For privatization to work, there are 6 prerequisites that are necessary. First, there has to be contestability in the market. Companies have to be able to come in and come out with ease. Secondly, there's need for capacity building if we're actually going to craft the right contracts to issue and monitor them. Third, there needs to be competition in the market to help keep prices low. Number 4, the need for accurate information. That way you are better able to project your costs and your revenue. Number 5, accountability. As we saw in the case of Bahamas, by failing to have an accountable, transparent system, you may actually make the situation worse than you started off with. And monitoring. The success of privatization is also heavily influenced by the government's ability to monitor the performance of their contracted companies. And we also found some other useful lessons. To begin with, we realized that a lot of the successful cases actually had multiple sources of revenue, and that perhaps was one of the reasons they succeeded. For cases where there may be an informational breakdown, the government and the private contractors need to develop a strong inter-organizational relationship to make up for any informational deficiencies. And third, no sustainable solid waste management system will work if the public isn't on board. That's how you get them to recycle and separate their waste at the source. So what do we do and where do we go from here? Well, first, we answer the question, should the NSWMA be privatized? We say yes. Now, the government has limited resources, so what should the government prioritize? We've concluded that waste collection and landfill management are 2 of the highest priorities right now. We recommend using the contracting out model for waste collection and either the contracting out model or concession agreements for waste management, for landfill management. We also heavily recommend considering the Riverton landfill for our waste-to-energy plant, and after dealing with the Riverton landfill, also engage the retirement landfill. Of course, this needs to be done under a competitive bidding process. And one of the mistakes we've observed with some governments is that they don't account for all the costs associated with this. You know, the cost of issuing the bid and monitoring, contracting or crafting the contract. A lot of these costs are not accounted for, and at the end of the day, we've realized that governments will have collected less than they initially planned to. Of course, accurate information again. The contract period would vary depending on which waste element is being privatized and the model being utilized. And this is important. The NSWMA, we don't think, should fully privatize. We believe the NSWMA should retain some capacity. One of the weaknesses of the contracting out model, for example, is that companies can up and leave or something can go wrong. So if the NSWMA retains some capacity, in the event that a company exits the market, the NSWMA can quickly intervene, minimize any inconveniences until another private entity can come in. And of course, the need for composting, recycling, and of course, considering waste to energy. Privatizing a collect and dump framework will not solve the problem. It only changes hands. We need to invest in what we have. Going by NSWMA data, 57% of residential waste is compostable, and 39% of it is recyclable. That means 96% of the waste we generate can be put to other use, but we throw it away. And we also need to effectively engage the public if we have any chance of making composting and recycling work. And that's something our government hasn't really done well at, engaging the public. So when we look back, ladies and gentlemen, at the discussions that took place in Parliament when the NSWMA Act, well, the Solid Waste Act, was being passed, we realized that it was the original intent to engage the private sector. Let me just read what one of the MPs said. It must be understood, Mr. Speaker, that the law provides not that it's going to be the National Solid Waste Management Authority itself that is going to be managing and operating these sites, but the opportunity that is given here is to have the private sector participation. You will now be able, instead of relying on one authority to collect waste that is generated, to have private sector participation. You can have persons operating landfills, persons recycling, persons collecting. So it's clear, ladies and gentlemen, that from the very beginning and inception of the Solid Waste Agency, private sector was supposed to play a role. We observed some other recommendations, and I'll quickly go through these. They are in the report. Improve data collection. Build a strong monitoring and regulatory framework. Complete the Portmore project. In 2015, the NSWMA announced that they'll be doing a privatization project in Portmore. And what we found is that pilot projects can really be useful tools for proof of concept. We will caution, however, that we believe it would be limited, or the pilot project would be limited in informing grander privatization initiatives, such as privatizing an entire landfill. And of course, incentivizing sustainable waste practices. That's how we're going to have recycling take place. And one of the things we've considered is that it's easier, perhaps, to change the behavior of an institution than to change the behavior of a household. So if we mandate, for example, that school canteens and restaurants and hotels, rather than discarding their waste, either separate it or process it for collection. If we mandate that, if we use our tax and tariff policies to incentivize companies to separate their waste so we can recycle it, we may be able to create an institutional culture that eventually, hopefully, could translate into a culture at home. So, ladies and gentlemen, should the Solid Waste Agency be privatized? Yes. Will privatization automatically solve our problems? No. There are 6 prerequisites that are necessary to make it work, and we need to take every effort, or make every effort, to ensure that those prerequisites are in place. What are our priorities? Waste collection, landfill management. Target the retirement landfill and the, which one was it? The retirement landfill and the Riverton landfill. And of course, we cannot leave out recycling and composting. Otherwise, we will not have an integrated, sustainable solid waste management system. Thank you.